If you grew up in Canada, you knew the Hostess munchies before you could read. Three little cartoon goblins, red and orange and yellow, on the shiny foil bag you tore open for the wrestling sticker hidden in the grease at the bottom. Behind that bag was the country's #1 chip brand, frying Canadian potatoes in Cambridge, Ontario, and selling to every lunchbox from the Maritimes to the coast. They survived the fruit chip flop of the '70s, survived every American rival, including Lay's, the biggest chip brand on earth, which couldn't beat them at home. They were winning a shelf war in 1991, buying competitors' bags off the racks by the caseload. And then, sometime in the '90s, the Hostess name simply stopped appearing on the bag. How does the #1 chip in the country vanish while it's still winning? What happened? Chapter 1. The smell in the Cambridge air. They'll tell you one arrogant decision killed Hostess. One boardroom, one signature, one American executive who couldn't stand that a Canadian chip was beating his, and who wiped a beloved name off the map to feed his own ego. It's a good story. It's the kind of story we like to tell ourselves about the things we used to make and don't anymore. The truth is quieter, and in its own way, it's sadder. Because Hostess didn't die in a single afternoon. It was absorbed, slowly, over the better part of 15 years, and by the time the name disappeared from the bag, the company hadn't been what most people thought it was for a very long time. Start in Cambridge, Ontario. There's a plant on Franklin Boulevard, low and long, that still fries potato chips today. The people who live nearby will tell you something that hasn't been true on paper for 30 years, that it's the Hostess plant. The name came off the front of the building generations ago. Nobody in town updated the memory. They'll also tell you that on a warm summer night with the windows down, you can smell what they're cooking, and you can tell which chips are coming off the line by the smell in the air. That smell, hot oil, salt, the earthy sweetness of frying potato, is where this story lives. Not in a boardroom, in a kitchen, on a farm, on the western edge of what was then the township of Waterloo, where a man began cooking chips in an iron kettle on his mother's stove. His name was Edward Snyder, and he never once called his chips Hostess. Chapter 2. Mr. Spud. Edward Groff. Snyder was born in the spring of 1905 on the family farm on Beaverdale Road, the youngest of 6 children. His father, Absalom, was the minister at Warner Mennonite Church and had been for 4 decades. This was deep Mennonite country, Waterloo County, settled generations before by people who had come north looking for land and quiet, and had found both. Snyder was not an immigrant. He was not a man of inherited money. He was a farmer's son who grew up in a faith that prized modesty, plain living, and work done well with your own hands. That upbringing matters, because it explains the shape of the man and everything he did with the company. The Mennonite culture of Waterloo County wasn't hostile to business. It was suspicious only of the vanity that sometimes came with it. You could prosper. You were simply expected to stay the same size on the inside while you did. Snyder would carry that his whole life. Later, he'd become a charter member of the Mennonite Economic Development Associates, an organization built on exactly that idea. That enterprise was a form of service, not a ladder out of your community. Keep that in mind. It's the reason the founder of a national brand could sell his life's work and vanish from its story without apparent regret. He became, first, a very good potato farmer. That matters too, because everything that followed grew out of the dirt. Snyder specialized in high-quality potatoes at a time when most people thought a potato was a potato. He got so serious about it that in 1945 he co-invented a machine, the Gray Snyder Potato Harvester, a piece of equipment for pulling more potatoes out of the ground with less back-breaking labor. That's worth pausing on. Before Edward Snyder ever thought about a snack, he was already an inventor, already a man who looked at ordinary farm work and saw a problem that could be engineered away. The chip business wasn't a lucky break for a simple farmer. It was the second act of a man who had a mechanical mind and a great potato. But the beginning was smaller than a harvester. It was a kettle. In 1935, Snyder started experimenting. He'd take his good potatoes, slice them thin, and fry them in a big iron kettle on his mother's kitchen stove. The peeling was done by hand. The salt came from shakers, shaken by hand. And one Saturday, he carried a small supply of these chips into the Kitchener market to see if anyone would buy them. He sold out by mid-morning. That's the moment. A farmer with a kettle and a hunch, watching strangers eat everything he'd made before lunch. It's the kind of small, clean beginning that industrial empires almost never have. No venture capital, no grand plan, just a man who made something good and discovered that other people wanted it too. The next Saturday, he brought more, and the Saturday after that. And soon, the market wasn't the business anymore. The business was the demand the market had revealed. The problem, the way it always is for people like Snyder, was freshness. A potato chip is a fragile thing. It goes soft, it goes stale, it loses the crackle, that's the entire point of it. And here's where the farmer did something a farmer had no business being able to do. Edward Snyder created the foil bag, a package that would keep the chips fresh and crisp on the shelf. This wasn't a recipe tweak. It was a genuine piece of packaging engineering, dreamed up by a Mennonite potato grower who'd never trained as anything but a man who worked the land. The same mind that had reinvented the harvest, reinvented the shelf life. Without that bag, Snyder's chips are a local Saturday morning treat that never leaves the county. With it, they can sit in a store across the province and still snap when you bite them. The foil bag is the reason there's a story at all. The business outgrew the stove almost immediately. First it moved into the Dottie house, the small attached dwelling on a Mennonite farm, where the grandparents traditionally lived out their years. Picture that, a national snack brand born not in a factory, but in the quiet little house where the old folks were meant to retire, the kettles going where a grandmother's rocking chair should have been. Then, by the early 1940s, the operation moved again, into a purpose-built factory on the land next door, on Beaverdale Road. His product had a name, and the name was simple and honest: Snyder's Potato Chips. The man himself stayed exactly who he'd always been. He married Glennie Snyder, a registered nurse, in 1938. They never had children, though his nieces and nephews loved him. They remembered fishing with their uncle, the good kind of uncle who had time for you. He stayed close to his church his whole life, and he drove around Waterloo County with a license plate that read, plainly, Mr. Spud. That's the founder, a modest, successful, devout man who invented a chip and the bag to keep it fresh, and who wore his whole identity on his back bumper. And here is the first thing the legend gets wrong. In 1955, Edward Snyder sold the company. He sold it to a man named E.W. Vanstone and stepped away from the business entirely. He would live another 36 years. He died in 1991, and he is buried at Warner Mennonite Cemetery, in the ground his family had worked for generations. He sold the company 16 years before the ketchup chip that would make the brand famous was even invented. He never called his chips Hostess. He was gone before there was a single munchie, before there was a jingle, before there was any of the stuff that Canadians would one day mourn. The man who started it all had already walked away. Which raises a question the legend never bothers to ask. If Hostess wasn't really Snyder's, and it wasn't really Canadian in the way people believed, then whose was it? Chapter 3. The name on the bag. The name Hostess arrived with the new owner. Under E.W. Vanstone, the company became Hostess Food Products, Limited, based in Preston, Ontario. Nobody wrote down who chose the word, or exactly when, or why. The record is genuinely blank on that point. Most likely it was a Vanstone-era decision, sometime in the second half of the 1950s. A bit of marketing meant to make a farm chip sound like something you'd be proud to set out for company. A hostess serves the good chips. That was the whole idea, and it worked. But Vanstone didn't hold it long either. In 1959, just 4 years after buying it from Snyder, the company was acquired by the American food giant General Foods through its Canadian subsidiary. Sit with that date for what it actually means, because this is the single most important correction to the whole story. The brand that Canadians would come to think of as 100% theirs, the fiercely proud Canadian chip, became American-owned in 1959. Nearly 3 decades before Frito-Lay entered the picture. Through the entire golden age that was still to come, the ketchup chips, the munchies, The lunchbox dominance, all of it, the profits of the Canadian brand flowed south to an American parent. The Canadianness of Hostess was real, but it lived in the potatoes and the plant and the people on the line. It was never in the ownership. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is older than the company itself. Go back to 1879 and the national policy, the wall of tariffs that Canada built to protect its own industries. The idea was straightforward. Make it expensive to ship American goods across the border, and American companies will decide it's cheaper to just build their factories inside Canada instead. It worked. For most of a century, the tariff wall is why so much of Canadian manufacturing was owned in Detroit and Pittsburgh and New York, but built and staffed in Hamilton and Windsor and Cambridge. The branch plant. The head office was somewhere else. The work was here. That's exactly why General Foods bought a chip company in Preston, Ontario. A potato chip is a terrible thing to ship. Mostly air, easily crushed, going stale by the mile. It was never going to be worth exporting American chips across the border into a market this size when the tariff made it expensive on top of everything else. So you did the obvious thing. You bought the plant that was already there, already winning, already understood the Canadian palate, and you let it keep being Canadian because its Canadianness was the product. General Foods didn't buy Hostess to change it. It bought Hostess to own it, quietly, and let the branch plant do what branch plants did. Make the local thing for the local market behind the wall. Remember that wall. Because everything that eventually goes wrong begins on the day it comes down. Under General Foods, with real capital and real distribution behind it, Hostess climbed. It went from an Ontario strength to a national force. A conglomerate's money bought fryers and trucks and shelf space that a farm operation could never have reached. The chips got into more stores, more provinces, more lunchboxes, from the Maritimes to the West. The company that had started on a farm stove now had the muscle of a continental parent behind it. And it used that muscle not to make Hostess more American, but, strangely, to make it more Canadian than ever. The branding leaned into the country. The chips were made from Canadian potatoes, cut thicker and seasoned harder than the thin, pale American chips across the border. And soon, Hostess would do the two things that fixed it permanently in the national memory. It would give Canada the ketchup chip, and it would give Canada the munchies. Chapter 4. When you've got the munchies. The ketchup chip is the crown jewel of the legend, and it deserves a moment of honesty before we hand it the crown. Hostess is popularly credited with introducing and popularizing the ketchup chip in Canada in the early to mid-1970s. A chip engineered to taste like a French fry, dragged through ketchup, red powder, and all. It became over time one of the most Canadian foods there is. Ask a Canadian abroad what they miss, and there's a decent chance the answer is ketchup chips. But the invention itself is contested, and the film shouldn't pretend otherwise. Down in Pennsylvania, Hares also lays claim to ketchup chips. And Janice Thiessen, the University of Winnipeg historian who wrote the book on Canadian snack food, argues that the whole question of who was first is both unanswerable and beside the point. Whether it was Hostess or Old Dutch or some company that doesn't even exist anymore, she says, doesn't really add to what we know. What we can say, cleanly and truthfully, is this. Hostess is the brand that made the ketchup chip a Canadian institution. Not the sole inventor, the one that made it ours. The other lasting invention was Hickory Sticks, thin, hard, hickory smoke-flavored potato sticks that came along in the 1970s. Remember them, because they turn out to be the survivor of this whole story. Of everything Hostess made, Hickory Sticks are the only product that still carries the Hostess name today. Not everything worked. In the mid-70s, somebody at Hostess decided the future was fruit-flavored potato chips, orange, cherry, grape. The public, by all accounts, responded with a universal dry heave. The fruit chips vanished quickly and completely, which is the correct fate for a grape-flavored potato chip. But it tells you something about the company in these years. It was confident enough and dominant enough to take swings that ridiculous and simply shrug off the misses. The flavors that stuck built the brand through color. Regular, salt and vinegar, barbecue, sour cream and onion, dill pickle, roast chicken, pizza, ripple, each one keyed to its own shade on the bag, so a kid could spot the one he wanted from across the corner store before he could read a word of the label. That was not an accident, and it was not small. Hostess is credited with helping set the color conventions the whole chip industry would come to follow. Blue for salt and vinegar, the ketchup red bag, the green of dill pickle. A visual grammar that outlived the company that wrote it. You learned the colors before you learned the words, and you carried that code into adulthood. And to this day, a Canadian of a certain age reaches for a bag by its color without ever reading it. And then, in 1981, came the masterstroke. Hostess introduced the Munchies, 3 goblin-like little cartoon characters, colored red, orange, and yellow, designed by a Canadian artist named Richard Siu. They took over the packaging, they took over the television, and they came with a jingle that anyone who was a Canadian child in the 80s can still sing without being asked. 'Cause when you've got the Munchies, nothing else will do. The Munchies became, as more than one person has put it, the Mickey Mouse of Canadian pop culture. Not a marketing campaign, a shared childhood. Full costume Munchie mascots toured grocery stores and events from coast to coast, and kids lined up to meet them the way they'd line up for a cartoon character at a fair. And inside, every bag was a small ritual, the giveaway. This is the part that turned a chip into a childhood. You didn't just open a bag of Hostess, you excavated it. Rock music stickers, wrestling stickers when the WWF was at the very peak of its popularity, when a foil fresh sticker of your favorite wrestler was a genuine schoolyard currency. Star Trek, the Next Generation cards. Movie tie-ins timed to whatever was in theaters. A generation of Canadian kids learned to tip the bag and let the chips slide aside to get at the treasure buried in the grease at the bottom, then eat the chips almost as an afterthought. The chip was the price of admission. The sticker was the show. The competition circled the whole time and could never quite land. Old Dutch, American-founded but running a Winnipeg plant since 1954, owned the West. Humpty Dumpty, born in Maine, held Quebec and Atlantic Canada. Quebec had its own Yum Yum, and Frito-Lay, PepsiCo's snack arm, carrying the global heavyweights Doritos and Ruffles and Lay's itself, had come into Canada in the late 1960s and simply could not take the potato chip throne. Lay's, the biggest chip brand on the planet, was being made in Canada under license through somebody else, and it still couldn't beat a chip that had started on a Mennonite farmer's stove. That was the shape of the empire at its height. A Canadian name, an American owner, a jingle every kid knew, and a rival, Lay's, that couldn't win no matter how big it was back home. Which is the part of the story worth holding on to. Because the company that would one day retire the Hostess name wasn't beating Hostess. It was losing to it. Chapter 5. The Batch and the Kettle. To understand what was made and what a shift on the line was actually like, you have to go inside the plant, because the plant is the part of this story that never went away. The heart of it was, and is, in Cambridge. And Cambridge itself is a stitched-together place, an amalgamation of 3 older towns, Galt and Preston and Hespeler, plus the little community of Blair, folded into one municipality in 1973. It's mill and factory country by temperament, a place that made things, and the chip plant fit right into it. This was the spiritual home of the brand, the ground the smell hung over on summer nights. The chips themselves came out of the way they were cooked. Hostess ran batch fryers, potatoes cooked in kettles in batches, rather than the thinner, faster continuous frying that made the pale American chip. The distinction sounds technical until you taste it. Batch frying is slower, more temperamental, more hands-on. It gave you a chip with more body to it, cooked harder, browner in spots. A chip that had some fight in it when you bit down. The kind of chip that could take a heavier seasoning without disappearing under it. And the potatoes were Canadian grown, which in this business is not a small thing. A potato chip is mostly potato and mostly place. The sugar content, the moisture, the way a particular field's crop browns in hot oil, it all ends up in the bag. Snyder had known that on his farm. The company that outgrew him 100 times over still ran on the same truth. Picture the work of it. The potatoes coming in by the truckload, graded, washed, the field dirt sluiced off in a rush of cold water. The peelers, the slicers, set to the thickness that made a Hostess chip. A Hostess chip and not some other companies. And then the fryers. The heat coming off them in a wall you could feel across the room. The oil at a rolling boil. The sound of it constant and total. A white noise you stopped hearing by mid-shift. The smell so thick you'd carry it home in your clothes and your hair and not be able to smell it yourself anymore, because you'd stopped noticing it around hour 2 of your first day. The salt going on while the chips were still hot. The flavor powders. The barbecue. The ketchup red. The sour cream and onion. Tumbled through in drums so the coating caught every surface. And at the end of it, the foil bags. Edward Snyder's own invention scaled up 1,000-fold, sealing it all in before the crackle could escape. It was hot work, and it was steady work. And in a country where so much industrial work meant fighting the cold, there was something almost gentle about a job where the building was always warm. Winter came off the parking lot in a slap, and then you were inside, in the heat, and the noise, and the smell, and the weather stopped mattering for 8 hours. That was its own kind of luxury on a February morning in Waterloo County. A factory that felt like the inside of an oven while the wind screamed against the corrugated walls. The town understood the difference between the company and the plant better than any head office ever would. Because to Cambridge, this was never a General Foods asset, or later, a line item on a New York balance sheet. It was where your neighbor worked, where your father worked. The plant that gave the neighborhood its smell, that put steady money into hundreds of local kitchens, that hired the kid down the street when he finished school. The ownership was an abstraction that lived somewhere far away. The work was concrete, and it was here, and it belonged to the people who did it. On employment, the honest answer is that the numbers are fuzzy. The company's own brief calls it thousands across the country in the 80s, and nationally across all its facilities. That's entirely plausible. But it isn't precisely documented, and a good film says so rather than inventing a figure and passing it off as fact. What we can say for certain is smaller and truer. The Cambridge plant is still there, and it still employs more than 550 people making chips today. And by the 1980s, those chips were simply everywhere. Hostess was the choice of almost every Canadian kid who bought a bag. The 25-cent bag in the shiny foil, pulled off a rack at the corner store, at the Becker's, at the variety shop on the way home from school. The taste got bound up with everything else about being a Canadian kid in that decade. With hockey, with summer, with the specific joy of ketchup dust on your fingers that you licked off one at a time so it would last. It was on the working man's lunch, too, cracked open at the plant, at the job site, set on the bar beside a pint at the end of a shift. It wasn't a premium product. It wasn't trying to be. It was the everyday chip of an entire country. That was the golden age. Not glamorous, ubiquitous, which, for a potato chip, is the same as immortal. Or it should have been. Chapter 6. The Chip War. Here's the thing the one arrogant decision story can't account for. At the exact moment Hostess was supposedly a wounded Canadian underdog being circled by American predators, it was the most aggressive player in the entire market. It was number 1 in Canada. It had been number 1 through the whole decade. And in the summer of 1991, it was throwing its weight around like a company that had no idea it was about to lose anything at all. By then, the corporate picture had already begun to shift. There'd been an arrangement struck with Frito-Lay in the late 80s, and we'll come to what that meant. But on the shelf, in the store, Hostess was still king, and it defended its territory with a ruthlessness that made the news. When Winnipeg's Old Dutch pushed east into Ontario, trying to take shelf space in Hostess's own backyard, Hostess responded by buying its rivals' chips off the shelves. Not competing with them, buying them. Entire stocks, whole store inventories, taken out of circulation so there'd be no Old Dutch bag left for a customer to reach for. An Old Dutch salesman named Duncan McPhail took the story to the CBC. He supplied 100 stores across Ontario, he said, and the same approach had been made at every one of them. They offer to buy all our product, McPhail told the CBC's Kelly Crow, at cost or at retail, and they tell the store never to carry Old Dutch again. The president of Hostess Frito-Lay, a man named Jim Postal, didn't deny it. He framed it as a favor to the retailer. In some of those situations, Postal said, the store owner was glad to have them buy the product off the shelf so he could make better use of his space. There was a young entrepreneur watching all this with a particular interest. Her name was Vicky Kerr, the Vicky of Miss Vicky's, the kettle chip that was becoming the taste of the upscale end of the market. She told the CBC she'd seen the same tactics used against her out west. Old Dutch complained to the federal government, to the Department of Consumer and Corporate Affairs. Remember Vicky Kerr, and remember that complaint. Both come back. But hold the picture of that summer in your mind, because it is the whole tragedy in a single frame. Hostess, in 1991, was not losing. Hostess was so dominant it was sweeping competitors' bags off the shelves by the caseload, denying them so much as an inch of space in an Ontario grocery aisle. This was a company at the absolute peak of its power, winning a war it had started, throwing elbows like a heavyweight who intended to hold the belt for another decade. The men on the line in Cambridge had no reason to think anything was wrong. Why would they? The chips were number one. The smell still hung over the neighborhood on summer nights. The munchies were still on television, still on the bag, still the Mickey Mouse of Canadian childhood. The foil bag was still on every lunch tray and every bar in the country. Nobody standing on that factory floor in the summer of 1991 could have told you that the brand had already been sold into an arrangement that would end it. That the wall, the tariff wall that had made a Canadian chip plant worth owning in the first place, had already come down 2 years earlier, quietly, on the first day of 1989. That the whole logic that had kept the Hostess name alive was already gone, and the name was simply waiting to catch up to the fact. They were winning. That was the problem. Chapter 7. The Tide That Took the Wall. For 110 years, there was a wall. Not a real one. A wall made of tariffs. The national policy of 1879, but real enough that you could build a company against it, lean your whole business model on it, and never once think about what would happen if it fell. Canadian manufacturing had grown up in its shadow. The branch plant existed because of it. Hostess was owned in America because of it, and stayed Canadian on the shelf because of it. The wall was the reason a New York conglomerate found it worth its while to make a distinctly Canadian chip in Preston, Ontario, and leave it distinctly Canadian. Then, on the 1st of January, 1989, the wall came down. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement had been the great national argument of the decade. It was signed in 1987 and fought over in the federal election of 1988, an election that turned almost entirely on this one question: whether Canada should open its border to American goods. Brian Mulroney won that election. The agreement came into force at the start of the new year, and 4 years later, on the 1st of January, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement widened the door further still, bringing Mexico in and knitting the three economies into one continental market. Here is what the agreements did, and it's important to say it plainly, without accusation. They didn't close a single factory on the day they took effect. What they did was remove the reason those factories had been built where they were. The tariff wall that had made Canadian branch plants necessary, that had made it cheaper to build here than to ship here, simply dissolved. And once it was gone, the logic reversed. Now a company could ask a question it had never needed to ask before. Why do we run a separate Canadian operation, with a separate Canadian brand, when we could serve the whole continent from wherever it's cheapest? For manufacturing towns across Ontario and Quebec, this was not an abstraction. It was experienced as a tide going out. As one industry paper reported in early 1992, more than 2,000 Canadian manufacturers had closed in the previous 3 years alone, with the Canadian Manufacturers Association predicting 1,000 more closures and another 100,000 jobs lost. On top of the 305,000 manufacturing jobs, 15% of the entire workforce that had already gone. That was the weather in which Hostess's fate would be decided. Not a boardroom vendetta, a continental climate change, and a beloved chip brand standing out in it. And the tide didn't only come from Washington. It came up the grocery aisle, too. The mass-market chip that Hostess had ruled was being eaten from both ends. From above came the upscale brands, Miss Vicky's, Kettle Chips, the crunchy, kettle-cooked, grown-up chip that the 80s had made fashionable. From below came the grocery house brands, the store-label bags that cost less and ate into the volume. And sideways came Pringles, in its can, not even pretending to be the same product. The 25-cent foil bag was still moving, but the ground it stood on was narrowing. None of that, on its own, would have killed the name. Hostess was still number one, but a dominant brand standing on shifting ground, owned by a foreign parent that no longer had any tariff reason to keep it separate, is a brand living on borrowed time. It just doesn't know it yet. It's still winning the chip war. It's still on every lunch tray. The wall was already gone. The name was still on the bag. The distance between those two facts is the rest of this story. Chapter 8. The Merger of Equals. That wasn't the end of Hostess did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as a series of them, each one reasonable, each one small enough on its own that nobody had to feel they'd done anything drastic. Laid end to end, they add up to an erasure. But no single link in the chain looks like murder. That's what makes it a tragedy and not a crime. It began in 1987, the same year the Free Trade Agreement was signed, which is not a coincidence, because the same continental logic drove both. Hostess Food Products, still owned by General Foods, entered a partnership with PepsiCo's Frito-Lay Canada. On paper, it was about product. It brought Doritos properly into the Canadian market, following the launch a couple of years earlier of a Hostess corn snack called Taquitos. In practice, it was a foot in the door. The Canadian potato chip champion and the global snack giant, no longer quite competitors, now partners. Then, in 1988, the partnership became a company, the Hostess Frito-Lay Company, a 50-50 joint venture between PepsiCo and General Foods. And here is a small, telling detail. Look at the order of the names. Hostess Frito-Lay. The Canadian brand came first. On paper, this was a merger of equals. Two companies, two names, both halves owned in equal measure. Hostess wasn't being swallowed, it was joining hands. Except a merger of equals is a very hard thing to keep equal, especially when one of the partners is one of the largest corporations on Earth, and the other is a chip division on a food conglomerate's balance sheet. The president of the joint venture was Jim Postel, the same Jim Postel who'd shrugged off the chip war allegations, the man running the winning brand. For a few years, the arrangement held. Hostess remained the major chip brand in Canada even after the merger. The name still led, the munchies still danced. It looked, from the outside and from the factory floor in Cambridge, like nothing much had changed. But behind it, the two halves were never going to stay balanced forever. And in the summer of 1992, the balance ended. On the 25th of June, 1992, PepsiCo bought out the other half. It acquired the remaining 50% of the joint venture from Kraft General Foods, General Foods having become part of Kraft after a merger 2 years earlier, for a sum that was never made public. Hostess Frito-Lay was now wholly, entirely, 100% owned by PepsiCo. An American parent had owned the brand since 1959. Now an American parent owned all of it, outright, with no Canadian partner left in the room at all. Jim Postel, asked about it, said he anticipated a closer working relationship between Pepsi and the company going forward. It was the kind of thing an executive says. It was also, read now, an epitaph. The closer the working relationship, the less room there was for a Canadian brand to be run as its own thing, rather than as a regional expression of a global one. And then, in a detail almost too neat to be true, the fold closed on the one who'd fought. On the 1st of February, 1993, Hostess Frito-Lay bought Miss Vicky's, the kettle chip belonging to Vicky and Bill Kerr, the same Vicky Kerr who, 2 years earlier, had gone to the CBC to describe how Hostess squeezed rivals off the shelf. The Kerrs said they wanted more time with their children. Postel said the brand would keep running as a separate unit. Miss Vicky's held around 1% of the national market. Small, but growing and prestigious. The upstart who had complained about the giant was now inside the giant. The war Hostess had been winning in 1991 was over, and Hostess had won it, and it no longer mattered who had won. because the whole board now belonged to one player. That's 4 years, 1987 to 1992. Partnership, merger, buyout, and a name that was still first on the letterhead, still first on the bag, still leading. To the men in Cambridge, the chips were the same. The line ran the same. The paycheck cleared the same. Somewhere far above them, in rooms they'd never see, the ownership had quietly consolidated into a single American whole. But that had been true, in one form or another, since 1959. The difference now was that there was no longer any structural reason, no tariff wall, no Canadian partner, no separate corporate logic, for the Hostess name to exist at all. It survived on momentum, on habit, on the fact that it was still winning, and you don't kill a winner. Until, one day, someone runs the numbers and decides that you do. Chapter 9. The Decision. By the mid-1990s, the language inside the company had changed. The people who ran the brand were no longer talking about how Hostess dominated. They were talking about brand erosion, the slow leak of a name losing its grip, squeezed by the upscale chips above it and the house brands below it, its old lunchbox generation growing up. Whether that erosion was real or exaggerated is almost beside the point. What matters is that it gave a reason. And a global company that owns the world's largest chip brand does not need much of a reason to ask why it's running a separate Canadian name at all. So in 1996, PepsiCo made the decision that the legend remembers as the murder. It decided to retire the Hostess name and rebrand the potato chips as Lay's. This is the moment the one arrogant decision story is built on, and it's worth being precise about what it actually was, because the truth is both less dramatic and, in its own way, more devastating. There was no executive who hated that a Canadian brand was beating him and killed it out of spite. There was no vendetta. What there was arithmetic. The same arithmetic that free trade had unleashed across the whole continent. PepsiCo, in that very year, was consolidating its snack businesses around the world into a single Frito-Lay operation. Lay's was the global master brand, the biggest chip name on the planet, sold in dozens of countries. The logic of a global company is to have one name everywhere, marketed once, understood instantly, from Toronto to Tokyo. Hostess was a magnificent, beloved #1 Canadian anomaly standing in the way of a tidy global map. There was even a genuine complication that made the decision messier than a simple flip of a switch. Lay's was already being sold in Canada, made under license through a third party. So retiring Hostess and raising Lay's meant untangling a trademark and distribution knot before the new name could even take the shelf cleanly. This was not the effortless stroke of a vengeful pen. It was a corporate project, with lawyers. And when they finally did it, here is the fact that detonates the whole legend. It worked, spectacularly. PepsiCo brought in the advertising agency BBDO Canada to launch the new brand. And the campaign did the most Canadian thing imaginable. It wrapped the American name in hockey. It put two of the biggest hockey stars in the country on the screen, Mark Messier and Eric Lindros, and used them to introduce Canadians to Lay's. The relaunch went out in 1997, and within 18 months, Lay's was selling twice the volume that the same chips had sold under the Hostess name. Read that again, because it's the hinge of everything. The decision that supposedly destroyed a great Canadian brand doubled the product's sales in a year and a half. It was not a blunder. It was not ego overriding good business. It was a strategy, and the strategy was correct, commercially, in every measurable way. More chips sold, more shelf space held. The world's biggest brand, finally winning the Canadian market it had never been able to crack. Not by beating Hostess, but by becoming Hostess. By pouring the same chips out of the same Cambridge fryers into a bag with a different name. The named hands on this are worth stating without accusation. Jim Postal ran the Canadian company. Above him sat PepsiCo's corporate leadership, including Roger Enrico, who had run Frito-Lay from 1991 and would go on to chair all of PepsiCo. The Canadian rebrand was not a Canada-specific decision aimed at a Canadian brand out of Canadian rivalry. It was one node in a worldwide consolidation, a single country's corner of a global map being colored in to match all the others. Nobody in New York was thinking about the smell over a Cambridge neighborhood on a summer night. That's the point. That's the tragedy. It wasn't personal. It was never personal. A piece of the country's soul was retired by people for whom it registered only as a branding inefficiency to be resolved. The chips themselves mostly survived the transition. The ketchup chip lived on under Lay's and thrived. The taquitos corn snack was folded into Doritos, and Hickory Sticks, quietly, almost by oversight, kept the Hostess name, the single artifact left standing when the rest of the brand was carried away. Was there dissent inside the company? Did anyone in Cambridge or in the Toronto offices argue to save the name? Almost certainly someone did. You don't retire a name that beloved without a fight somewhere in a meeting room. But that fight, if it happened, was never documented, and this film won't invent it. What the record shows is cleaner and colder. Brand erosion cited, a global master brand chosen, a hockey campaign launched, sales doubled. The decision that Canadians would come to mourn was, by the only measures its makers used, a triumph. And it cost the country a piece of itself anyway. That's the thing the arithmetic couldn't see on its spreadsheet. Both things are true at once. The decision worked. And it took something that couldn't be put in the ledger. Chapter 10. No funeral. There was no last shift. That's the strange, quiet heart of this collapse. The thing that sets it apart from every other story in this series. There were no gates chained shut. No final product signed by workers with markers brought from home. No taillights leaving a parking lot in the snow for the last time. The Cambridge plant didn't close. It never closed. It's frying chips right now. What died was a name. And a name dies differently than a factory. It doesn't die on a Tuesday at the end of the afternoon shift. It fades. Here's how the fade went. In 1996, the rebrand began. And the Munchies, those three little characters that had been the Mickey Mouse of Canadian childhood for 15 years, came off the chip bags. In 1997, the Messier and Lindros campaign put Lay's on television. By around 1998, Lay's was outselling the old Hostess volume 2-1, and the Hostess name had largely disappeared from the shelf. And in 2002, the corporate entity itself, the Hostess Frito-Lay company, was renamed Frito-Lay Canada. The last place the name lived, the name on the incorporation papers, was quietly overwritten. The trucks were repainted. That's the detail people remember, when they remember any of it. The Hostess trucks going into the shop one livery and coming out another, the red and yellow giving way to the Lay's sunburst. The mascots were retired to wherever mascots go. Only the Hickory Sticks bag held the old wordmark. An accident of survival nobody bothered to correct. And the thing about a fade is that you don't notice it while it's happening. There was no news bulletin. Canada's #1 chip brand ceases to exist tonight. There was just a Tuesday where the bag on the rack said, Lay's, and you were busy, and you bought it, because it was the same chip, and you were used to reaching for that spot on the shelf. And then 100 Tuesdays like it. The morning, when it came late. Years later, in retrospect, when someone at a party said, "Remember Hostess," and the whole table went quiet with the surprise of realizing it was gone. When the CBC archives got dug up. When somebody wrote an essay online with a title like Munchie Murder and thousands of people shared it, not because it was accurate, it wasn't. It was the very legend this film corrects, but because it gave a shape and a villain to a loss that had actually happened with no villain and no shape at all. That's the cruelty of it, if you want to call it cruelty, though it's really just the way these things go. A factory closure gives a town a day to grieve. A last shift, a photograph, a date to circle. Hostess got none of that. It was denied even a funeral, because from the company's point of view, nothing had died. The plant was humming, the chips were selling better than ever, the ketchup chip was still ours. Only the name was gone. And you can't hold a funeral for a name. You can only, eventually, notice the silence where it used to be. The men in Cambridge kept their jobs. That's real, and it matters. And it's why this was never the tragedy the legend claims. Nobody in that plant lost a paycheck to the rebrand. They went on making the same chips they'd always made. But the thing they were making no longer had their name on it. They were frying Lays now. In the plant, the whole town still called Hostess, and both of those things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. Chapter 11. The Munchies Come Home. Go to Cambridge today, Franklin Boulevard. The plant is right there, long and low and busy. Part of Frito-Lay Canada now, part of PepsiCo Foods Canada, a company that employs more than 6,000 Canadians across 7 plants from Nova Scotia to Alberta. The Cambridge facility alone employs more than 550 people. And in 2019, it was modernized with a $3 million investment from the Ontario government, positioned, in the company's words, for future growth. This is not a ruin. There is no rust here, no birch pushing through the loading dock, no snow drifting through a broken window into machinery that hasn't moved in decades. The fryers are running. The trucks are full. Which means the usual final image of these films, the silent plant, the patient forest, the wind where the furnace roar used to be, isn't available here. The ghost of this story isn't a building. You can't stand in its ruins because it doesn't have any. The ghost is the name, and you'll find it in exactly one place. A bag of Hickory Sticks, still carrying the Hostess wordmark, the last survivor of a brand that once ruled the country. You can buy it right now. Hold it in your hand, and you're holding the whole of what's left. One product, one name, a small foil flag planted on a shelf that forgot the rest of the map. The ketchup chip is still here too, of course, thriving under the Lay's name, still one of the most Canadian foods there is. As one writer put it, whatever else changed, the ketchup chips remain ours, which is the deeper truth the historian Janice Thiessen has spent a career arguing. That snack food isn't trivial, that it weaves itself into who a people think they are, that the chip in the lunchbox is a thread in the national fabric, whether or not anyone owns the name on the bag. And then, in 2024, the circle closed in a way nobody could have scripted. On the 9th of September, 2024, PepsiCo Foods Canada brought the Munchies back. The same 3 characters, red, yellow, and orange, revived as a brand of their own, with 6 flavors, including a tangy ketchup and an old-school barbecue explicitly built as nods to the Hostess originals. The company's chief marketing officer, Jess Spalding, explained it in the plain language of the trade. Nostalgia, she said, taps into our deepest emotions and memories, and there was something inherently special about this brand and what it meant to the original fans. There was a downtown Toronto pop-up, a living room people could walk through and remember their childhoods in. There was a statue of the 3 Munchies raised in a Toronto park. Read that slowly because it's the whole story folded into a single gesture. The company that retired the Munchies in 1996, that judged the Hostess name an inefficiency and traded it for a global brand, that same company, 28 years later, dug up the characters and built a statue to them. It is now selling Canadians nostalgia for the very thing it erased. And the reason there's nostalgia to sell is that it did the erasing. The absence created the longing. The longing created the market. And the market got served, on schedule, by the people who'd made the absence in the first place. There's no anger in saying that. It's just what happened. It's how these things work now. A brand is a thing to be optimized when it's in the way, and a thing to be resurrected when there's demand for the feeling of it. The chip was always the same chip. Only the name kept getting decided. So what was actually lost? Not the factory. It's right there, frying. Not the ketchup chip. Still ours. Not even the Munchies. Back on a shelf, cast in a statue. What was lost was smaller than all of that and harder to hold. It was the belief that the thing was ours in a way that couldn't be undone. A generation grew up thinking Hostess was Canada's, the way the maple leaf was Canada's. A fixed fact you never had to defend, because who would ever take it? And it turned out the name had been American-owned since 1959. And it turned out a name can be retired between one Tuesday and the next. And it turned out you wouldn't even notice until it was long gone. The plant on Franklin Boulevard is still warm tonight. If the windows are down and the wind is right, the neighborhood still smells the potatoes frying, still tells the newcomers that's the Hostess plant, no matter what the sign says. The town keeps the name the company gave up. It's the last true thing in the story. A memory a whole community refuses to update, holding on to a word that the people who owned it decided, one reasonable afternoon, they didn't need anymore. Not murdered, just quietly set down, and picked up again, years later, to be sold back to us, as the feeling of something we used to own.